rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Make a start then. Well, welcome everybody to this evening's regular WIN meeting. The subject of tonight's discussion is China. We have very fortunate to have 4 speakers tonight who all got stuff to tell us. China's a very pertinent issue at the moment. There's a lot of with the trade war with America, there are lots of conflicts along China's border. There's the unrest and conflict and instability along the Sino-Indian border, and there have been lots of skirmishes recently. There's a question of the Uyghurs, I think, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, the Turkish community that lives in the north of China. There's a trade war going on around Huawei, is it, and the 5G issues, more competition with the trade war with the USA, and also the whole of the Hong Kong issue. So I shall hand you across to Roger, who will now introduce our speakers for this evening.
Yes, we're really, I think, really privileged to have such experts tonight on this question. We've got Greg Benton, who's the foremost expert on the history of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Trotskyist opposition. He's the author of several books, including Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution, Was Mao Really Monster?, Poets of the Chinese Revolution, Prophets Unarmed, Chinese Trotskyists in Revolution, War, Jail, and the Return from Limbo. We also have another leading authority on China, John Sexton, also a Trotskyist, a leading expert and writer on China, and who lived there for many years. And we also have our very own Ed Bober, prominent member of WIN and a writer, including several articles on China for our magazine On the Brink. So let's get going. Thank you. You're muted, Pam. Pam, you're muted.
Not a good start, is it? Right, have you worked out an order in which we're going to ask people to speak, and about how long for each person?
It's up to the comrades, but I would suggest Greg, then John, then Ed. If that's okay?
Greg. John. So will 10 minutes each be enough, or do you need longer than that, comrades? The comrades are speaking.
I think John...
I offered comrades a little more than that.
Oh yeah, well that's why I'm asking you how long.
John has suggested that he leads off.
Okay.
With about 20 minutes.
Fine.
If that's okay.
Yep.
I mean, it's up to him to tell you what he's doing, but that's what he wrote to me. Yeah.
That's right.
I'm just trying to establish, for monitoring the discussion. And what about Greg and Ed? Are you wanting 20 minutes as well, or?
Oh, I don't need 20 minutes.
All right. It's 15.
Just less, even less, and okay, we can have a discussion. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, thanks, Greg.
As for me, I've got about 15 or 20 minutes worth of material, but it's quite possible that Greg or John will say some of what I want to say, in which case I'll speak for a bit less.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Okay, right. Well, John, would you like to make a start, please?
Unmute yourself, yeah. John, there we are.
Okay, can you hear me now? No? Okay, thanks for flattering me for saying I'm an expert. I hope some of this will be enlightening. So can I start by plugging my book, The Alliance of Adversaries, it's called, and it's about the Congress of the Toilers of the Far East. It's that happened in 1922, quite a significant event in the history and quite influential in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. It's not an irrelevant plug. I wanted to start off by talking about the character of the Chinese Revolution, really, which Jiang Guotao, who was leader of the Chinese Communist Party delegation to the Congress, he said, before we went to this Congress, you know, the Communist Party existed. It had various vague ideas about communism, the workers' movement, and so forth, but no particular.
John, can I just stop you a minute? He sounds very poor. I think we're having trouble hearing you. I'm just wondering if you could turn your video off just while he's speaking. Is it worth a try?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's very weak.
We find a nationalist aspect of the Chinese Revolution that in contrast to the Russian Revolution, which was very internationalist in inspiration. You know, the Russian leadership was, you know, horrified by the collapse of the Second International. I mean, there were troops marching up and down the street, carrying heavy weapons. It was quite an unpleasant atmosphere.
Okay. Oh, he stopped you.
Sorry?
Right. Okay, so we stop for now. Thanks, John. We're still having trouble with your sound. I'm going to bring Greg in now. You've asked for about 10 minutes. I'll warn you about 8 minutes past, shall I? Do you want me to do that? Is that okay? You need to unmute yourself. Hang on, I'll do it. There you are. I can hear you. Should be able to hear you now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't think I'll need 10 minutes. I just talked briefly about two of the issues that Roger raised in his circular. The first one is minority policy in the Uyghurs. The minority policy adopted by the Chinese communists was largely based on the policies followed in the Soviet Union, but there are significant differences in the situations in the two countries. In the first place, in China, the so-called minority population, we use this term national minority. If you looked at the so-called national minorities in their actual political and geopolitical context, they're majorities. They are peoples in their own territories, and often territories that previously were under their political control. So they're more nations than national minorities. But let's go along with the Chinese terminology there. The national minorities in China were always a very small percentage, less than 10%, at one point counted as around 6% of the population, whereas in the Soviet Union, so-called national minorities made up half of the population. So they have a different specific weight, and moreover, they're different in nature, whereas the so-called national minorities in the Soviet Union were in many cases people commanding advanced economies and advanced cultures. In China, most of the so-called national minorities are people who are pre-literate or were pre-literate before 1949, who have no economic clout and so on. So on the whole, the Chinese policy towards its national minorities can be said to have been extremely progressive. The Chinese communists brought to the national minorities alphabetization, they created scripts, they created national unified languages for ethnic groups that had many dialects, mutually incomprehensible, and so on. And this is very important to bear in mind. It's bigger minorities along the borders, were treated in a rather different way. Throughout China, the majority of Chinese who count themselves as Han, that itself is a construct, because Han can be divided into all sorts of groups that under any other system of classification would be called ethnic minorities or peoples rather than members of a unified Han group. But the Han have, on the whole, through their policies towards national minorities, tried to assimilate these minorities to themselves, to teach Chinese, which is the Han language, the Han script, and so on, and to absorb leaders of national minorities into the power system based on Beijing. The attitude of the Chinese communists towards the Uyghurs has been rather different from its policy towards other peoples. And why is this? It's interesting to consider why this has happened. One reason is because the Uyghurs sit right on the frontier and moreover straddle the frontier with other groups, either of Uyghurs or of related peoples, Turkish peoples, on the other side of the frontier from the Chinese frontier. And this is quite dangerous because we're dealing here with a volatile region in which nations are forming and reforming and beginning to assert themselves. And this worries Beijing. I think at one point there was also a feeling in Beijing that with the anti-Islamic mood in the West, as exemplified in the Gulf Wars and the rise of Trumpism and so on, that they could get away with this, that they could get away with treating the Uyghurs and would be praised for it by the West. Of course, that didn't happen. The Uyghurs are also less assimilated than even the least assimilated other national minorities apart from the Tibetans. They have their own language, which is completely different, belongs to a different language family, has a different script and so on from Chinese, whereas a Tibetan is a member of the same language family. It has its own religion, and it's a very particular religion. The Chinese find it quite easy to deal with Taoism, less easy but not too difficult to deal with Buddhism, not too difficult to deal with Christianity with its myriad sects and with its accommodationist pope and so on. But the Uyghurs are different because of their Muslim religious identity. Islam in itself is not a barrier to good treatment in China. There are two different sorts, well, two big sorts of Muslims in China. One of the Muslims based in northwest China around Xi'an, who are called the Hui people, and there's never, as far as I know, been any trouble from them. The Uyghurs, however, have two identities that sit one on the other. A national identity, because they were a nation with their own territory and their own external apparatus and so on for many years before 1949. And the other is their religious identity, which is centralist, and of course, which has links to Islamic movements or Islamic cultural identities elsewhere in the world. The other question I wanted to talk about was this Cold War thing. And I just wanted to make a few distinctions between China and the Soviet Union, because I think often they're too glibly identified as the same thing. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s, it had already lost the confidence of most of its people. Its economy was in ruins. It had not made any steps towards a deep economic reform of the sort that the Chinese carried out. And this is very important for understanding the difference between the two countries. China, on the other hand, I know there's a debate in your group about the class nature of the Chinese economy and state, but it seems to me indisputable by now after 40 years of reforms. We're not talking about 3 years of the NEP, as in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. We're talking about 40 years of progressive capitalization or capitalization, or whatever the word is, of the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy has become deeply integrated at all levels with the world economy, including the US economy. Look at this question of Huawei and what's it called, TikTok? John was talking about it a moment ago. That the economies are very deeply integrated, and it's very difficult for the capitalist powers headed by the United States to treat China in the same way as they treated the Soviet Union, because they're harming their own interests in doing so. Another issue, it seems to me, is that China still has a very strong patriotic core of feeling against intervention by foreigners in Chinese affairs. I think that if it came to it, and if the United States were threatened with economic chaos and the possibility of war, I think they'd be more likely to collapse, and collapse more quickly than would China, which has an abiding detestation of imperialism because of the way in which China was devastated by imperialist aggression early in the 20th century.
Greg, you've had about 10 minutes now.
I've had 10 minutes.
About, yeah.
Yeah, I'm almost finished, so don't worry. I therefore think that in China we have a rising capitalism. We have a reasonably unified population behind the nationalistic goals of the regime, and I think that that Trump or Biden or whoever it is who leads the crusade against the Chinese communists will find it difficult to carry it through to a successful conclusion. Finally, on the Cold War thing, I'm thinking here particularly about the South China Sea. This is often posed as an issue between China and the Americans and the Australians because of rights of passage across disputed waters and so on. This is not really the issue. Much more important is the threat posed by the Chinese imposition on this huge stretch of water, which is almost the size in water of the terrestrial magnitude of China, the effect on the surrounding countries, such as Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Borneo, and so on. These are the countries that are threatened by Chinese expansion, and of course they should be supported in their efforts to prevent China from taking over the entire region. That's what I have to say, Ben. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Greg. That's extremely interesting. Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll come back to that later in the discussion, and people have lots of questions to ask you. So the third speaker this evening is Ed. Now, Ed didn't know how long you wanted. Have you any idea now? Now you've heard what's been said already.
I'll try and keep to about 15 minutes, Pam, if that's okay.
Thanks, Ed.
Okay. Now I want to show a slide to begin with, but I'm not sure if I can see how I'm meant to do it. Hang on a moment.
Share screen.
Share screen. Share screen. And what am I showing now? Am I showing what you want to see? Am I showing the slide?
The sound's not very good now. Yes, we can see it.
Can everyone see a slide?
Yeah, we can see your page, but your sound's not really.
Has the sound gone bad?
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
I'm back.
Let's go. Right, look. Sorry, the sound's come back.
Yeah,
that's better.
That's when you do what you did before, Ed, and maximise that particular screen, and then it should enlarge it so we can see it more clear. That's it. but you've got the wrong one up now.
Heard all the problems this evening.
It's going to be worth it, I'm sure.
I've complete. Hang on, is that it? No, that's not it. Sorry, folks, I've lost it. I've just totally lost it. I forget about my slide. I thought someone else was going to do it for me, and I just wasn't ready for that.
Right. You need to stop sharing your screen though, Ed, because we've still got your desktop here. No, we've now got a Word document. You're still screen sharing. Dave Buxton, can you advise?
No, sorry. If you do Alt-Tab,
Yes.
then it should take you through the screens that you've already opened, Ed. And
So,
then you,
what should it be?
then you may come across the screen that you actually wanted to show.
Right, sorry, what do we do?
Press Alt and then Tab once. No, not
Alt and...
you. Not you. Ed has
Oh,
to.
sorry.
So Alt and Tab, and just touch the tab once, and it will then should take you through the screens you have open. Right, can you see it now, the one you wanted to show?
No.
Okay, click on share screen again. I'm hoping that will close your share screen.
I can't even see share screen any longer.
What?
I can't see it. That's why I can't do it.
Okay, Pam, transfer the host over to me and then I'll sort it out.
Right, I'll do my best. Hang on. Participants.
And Ed, we can see you, so if you want to start talking, you can.
Yeah.
It's just your very...
Right. Sorry, folks, I really didn't know it was going to be so difficult to show a slide. And the slide is simply meant to illustrate visually the fact that China has overtaken the US in the percentage share of manufacturing world trade. It's overtaken the US in about the last 5 years. China's developed as an economic power, as other comrades have indicated, over the past 30 years. It's done this by the growth of large-scale industrial production in economic development zones where there's been an unlimited supply of cheap labor, where trade union rights are suppressed, and overseas capitalist investors have been able to come in and take advantage of this huge reserve of cheap labor. It's a capitalist investment under highly controlled conditions, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And as I won't go into the details here because I think both Greg and John have illustrated it, it's bound global economies together in very, very profound, intricate ways. And that's definitely one reason why any talk about a replication of the Cold War is somewhat superficial, because the US economy is far more heavily interdependent with the Chinese economy than the US economy ever was with that of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Belt and Road Initiative that's been launched by the Chinese authorities in Beijing is a project to develop connectivity infrastructure, mostly by land, but also by sea, by train and by road, from China into Europe. There are already rail connections with Germany, into Africa, and into the southern parts of Asia. And it is seen by many Western capitalist powers as a threat because it places China in a position where they can begin to trade with nations that can easily be drawn into a Chinese sphere of influence. One such example of that is mentioned in the advert that went out for this meeting, the Sino-Indian border conflict. China is actually developing a deep water port in Pakistan that will be connected by road and rail directly through the Himalayas into China. And of course, with the long history of border disputes between China and India, any encroachment of Chinese influence onto the western border of India is seen as a huge provocation by the Indian ruling class. One of the consequences of the huge development of industry in China over the last 30 years is that hundreds of millions of people who previously worked on the land as peasants have been drawn into mighty industrial complexes on the east coast of China. And these are places, you know, John and Greg have referred to them with some of the companies they've mentioned. They're places where literally hundreds of thousands of workers work together for one company in one factory or in a conglomeration of factories. And it's given rise to a hugely powerful working class, far, far more powerful than anything that's existed on the planet before. And this working class has showed its capacity for militancy. I know when I last discussed this with Greg was suggesting caution to me not to get over optimistic and too carried away about the capacity of this working class to bring about political revolution against the Stalinist bureaucracy. So I'll try and deal with facts rather than projections and anticipations of what might happen. We had in the 3 or 4 years at the beginning of the 2010s to 2015s, that round about that period, we had an enormous strike wave where tens of thousands of strikes took place in China. They weren't very much publicized in the West. They led to very, very high levels of militancy, of confrontation between Chinese industrial workers, many of them women workers, and the police and factory security guards, in which thousands of people suffered arrest, police brutality, and so on. And even more importantly than that, from the point of view of the world economy, wage rises, colossal wage rises were won by the Chinese working class because of the fear and panic that went into the companies that were employing these workers and into the bureaucracy in Beijing. It shows the capacity of the Chinese working class to take militant action. The Hong Kong movement therefore terrifies the authorities in Beijing. Hong Kong, incidentally, has never been a democracy. Under British authorities, it was run by the rich with the assistance of British governors. It's never been a democracy. The movement for democracy in Hong Kong is terrifying to the bureaucracy in Beijing because of the possibility that it might spread its contagious effect, its militancy, into the mainland. There have been some of the activists in the Hong Kong movement have identified with Black Lives Matter because they have said these people face the same police brutality as us. So talk in the West that the Hong Kong democracy movement is somehow lined up with the objectives of Western capitalist powers really is somewhat superficial and doesn't recognize the fact that Hong Kong is an extremely divided nation with big divisions between rich and poor, where if you are of a low-income family, the chances, because real estate prices have gone so high because of property speculation, the chances of getting even one bedroom to live in on your own, if you're on a low wage, is virtually zero. And this is why there's such enormous frustration and anger in Hong Kong. People don't just go to riot and fight the police heroically as they have done because they are fighting for some abstract democracy. They're fighting for their rights because Hong Kong society is so divided between rich and poor, and that terrifies the bureaucracy in Beijing. I think Greg's spoken very eloquently about the national minorities and particularly the Uyghur population. And I don't want to add very much more to what he said, except this, that it's been reported that there are about 1 million people have been incarcerated. That's 1 million Uyghurs out of a population of Uyghurs in China of about 12 million. About 1 million of them have been incarcerated, imprisoned. If you ever wanted to start a campaign to purge society of religion, the very worst way to do it is what the Chinese authorities have done. Women have been raped in these prisons. Prisoners in these prisons have been given food when they're at the point of being very hungry, the point of starving. They've been given food on condition that they renounce their religion. It reminds me, the relationship between the bureaucracy and the Uyghur population in China reminds me of the relationship between the Polish bureaucracy in the 1980s and the Polish workers as they flocked to Catholic churches because the church represented a symbol of opposition to the regime. And if you ever wanted a campaign that's guaranteed to backfire against the bureaucracy in Beijing, it's this attempt to coerce the Uyghur population into shedding itself of its commitment to Islam. Is this a repeat of the Cold War? Well, Trump's tariffs are more an attempt to whip up nationalist sentiment in his own backyard because of his failings on the economy and on the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic in China has raised political consciousness enormously and showed what Chinese communities are capable of. First of all, it was medical staff who in December of 2019 started trying to alert the world that a pandemic was coming, and their voices were repressed by the Chinese bureaucracy. Initiatives of the population in Wuhan were what led to the first lockdown, contrary to what the Chinese media would like the world to believe. It wasn't the Chinese bureaucracy understanding the need for a lockdown. It was people power initiatives, because the population in Wuhan feared the spread of this virus, that they began to organize their own lockdown. And as they did so, the bureaucracy realized this was necessary, learned from the movement of the people, and then began to take control of it. And when the Chinese vice premier went to visit Wuhan to try and give the impression that this was an initiative by the Chinese government, there were protests in Wuhan from inside people's houses, shouting fake, fake, fake as he went through the streets, because the people of Wuhan wanted to get the message to the media that this was not a government initiative. This was the people of Wuhan having organized this initiative themselves. So that's a reason why, another reason why the bureaucracy in Beijing are very, very frightened, because the strike wave of a decade or so ago may have fizzled out, but there have been other strikes. There have been strikes of building workers, crane drivers. There have been strikes of airline staff and so on. And the discontent around the way that the COVID crisis has been handled, all of these things make the Chinese population as a whole a tinderbox. All these incidentally, on the east coast of China, all these different national minorities come together in the places of work. They are one proletarian movement rather than being isolated individual national minorities. So
You've had 15 minutes. We'll suggest you go on for a bit because you got interrupted, didn't you? So I don't know how.
I'm finishing. I'm finishing now, Pam.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm finishing.
Right.
It's not the same. It's not the same as the Cold War. Capitalism globally is weaker. The Chinese working class is stronger. The world economy is more integrated and more interdependent, and the options for the West are far more limited. It is possible, therefore, that what we're seeing today in China in terms of the development of political consciousness will result in something new for humanity, a political revolution that could give rise to a country that is based on a socialist planned economy, but has all the oxygen of democracy that is required for a healthy development of culture and development of humanity to the highest levels possible of production, education, and enjoyment of life.
Thanks, Ed. That was a very, very interesting contribution. We just got a slight problem at the moment because Dave Buxton is sharing your screen and I can't see anything at the moment. Oh, that's better, right? Thanks. Yeah, thanks. That's been 3 really, really, interesting and insightful contributions to the situation in China. So I'll throw this open to discussion. I suggest we all try and stick to about 5 minutes till everybody's at least said something, and perhaps the speakers might want a few minutes to sum up at the end. So I'm looking to see if there's any hands up. If you could please indicate in the box up the side. Jim Christie, okay? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, thanks very much for all the speakers. I just wanted to say something about the wider geopolitical issues and the rival imperialisms. It seems to me that we are talking of a classic clash of imperialisms. The Thucydides trap that people mentioned, of course, was one of an existing power being threatened by a rising power. And the American academic who wrote it listed a whole number. And it seems to me that it's exactly what we are dealing with here, of different imperialisms as well. You see it in the West, not just in America, but you see it in Europe as well. You see Chinese influence very much in countries such as Hungary and in Greece. But you see it in Germany, that has moved now to say that China is no longer a strategic partner, but a strategic competitor. And of course, Britain, that was going to be the home of the great Chinese money and everything else, in the post-Brexit world, it's huddling much closer to American imperialism, and therefore has had to move away from its closer links with China. But I think we would be wrong to think that the issue in terms of America is purely down to just Trump. Trump has concentrated on the trade issues, but there is a wider strategic interest, which seems to me that America has been pursuing over decades and will continue, whoever is the president, to try and curb the rising power of China, particularly in East Asia, which China sees as its sphere of influence, which, similar to America, sees the Americas classically in the Monroe Doctrine. From 2005, the Americans switched their resources, their military resources, to the Pacific. 60% of American military resources were switched to the Pacific sphere of command. Obama proclaimed himself as the first Pacific president. And I think that although Trump, I think, has made major strategic mistakes in regards to American imperialism, not least over the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which he tore up. Whatever the economic aspects of that, that was one which united countries around the Pacific politically and excluded China. Nevertheless, I think that the conflict between America and China will continue, whoever is in the White House, because I think these imperialisms are on a collision path. China, I think, is interesting, and I'd welcome particularly Greg and others' comments on it, of how far this is a push and how far it is a pull in terms of the nationalism, the push being the imperatives of imperialism, and the pull being the diversionary aspect of using it as against the century of humiliation of imperialist powers. But it's a real contrast to what leaders of China were saying 30, 40 years ago after Tiananmen Square, and Deng Xiaoping was talking about we must hide our capacities, and even much more moderate ones of Xi Jinping and Hu Bintao, to what Xi Jinping is now doing. And it seems to me that if you look at Chinese imperialism, it has a whole number of different aspects to it. One is very clearly the sphere in East Asia, what's called the A2D2 of aerial denial of the Americans in there, and pushing them further back with their missile anti-aircraft carrier capacity they are building up, pushing America back into its sphere of influence. And there are obviously widespread possibilities of flashpoints. People have talked about it in the Uyghurs, we've talked about it in terms of India and China, the South China Seas. We now see joint American-Vietnamese naval exercises to combat China. And anyone who's been to been to Vietnam, will know the virulent anti-Chinese atmosphere that is cultivated by the Vietnamese elite, which goes back, of course, in terms of tributary and history. There are many ones, but the one I would just like to mention in passing is Taiwan. Taiwan is unfinished business as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned. It sees it as part of mainland China they would wish to reclaim, though it was only ever for about 200 years ever in any way nominally done during the Qing dynasty. America is still tied to China by the Taiwan Relations Act, which is probably stronger than the previous defense treaty. But, and you've seen in the past when Taiwanese nationalists have taken control and won elections in Taiwan, that China has sent rockets in to show its power, and America has paraded, as it did in 1996, mentions of the Pacific Fleet. I just wonder whether they would do that if China did start to move, as it's threatened to do in the near future, against Taiwan. You look at the Taiwanese military now, and it's no longer thinking they will repel them on the beaches. It's talking about an inland defense and an offensive capacity of 1,000-mile missiles into mainland China. It is a real genuine flashpoint, I think, which hasn't properly been recognized. And what you've got now, I think, as far as China is concerned, that is unfinished business. The other thing I would say is that China is now in a classic imperialist role. It was never formally a great naval power, if you kind of take a passing view of the Ming treasure fleets of Zheng He in the 15th century. But it's now got its first military overseas base in Djibouti in East Africa to safeguard the oil. I think, as someone mentioned earlier, it's got developing the port capacity, long lease in Gwadar in Pakistan, which will use as a military capacity. So it seems to me China is moving into a classic imperialist role. I think it's totally different, this is my final remark, totally different from the model that people use in terms of the Soviet Union in China for all the reasons that people have mentioned. The CIA always used to dismissively, in a racist way, called the Soviet Union up a Volta with rockets. Well, that's not the case with China. China is a thrusting modern economy and powerful one. I think this Cold War is here to stay.
Thanks, Jim. Just before I'm bringing the next speaker, iPhone, you've had your hand up for about 45 minutes. I take it that's not deliberate. Okay.
I've asked on the chat that iPhone changes their name, and I've given instructions as well as how that is to be done.
Right.
Because their video's not on either, and I don't think that's really how we should conduct meetings, where people are totally anonymous.
Okay.
So you should take that into account.
Right, okay. Right, in that case, David Hempson had his hand up next. David Hempson? Is he there? David, could you unmute yourself, please, David Hempson? Oh, right. How do I do it?
Okay, so my apologies. I thought I was more technically proficient. Look, we've got the elements of really a really good discussion, and it's right. It's so contemporary. If I could say, in relation to the to the really big issue in terms of the balance of forces internationally between China and America, the stress has been, on the crisis in America. And it's true, America is being strategically weakened by Trump. To an extent, I don't think the American ruling class has really taken on board until quite recently. In fact, just in the last couple of weeks, I think it's become a lot clearer. And that Trump is trying to deglobalize to some extent, to pull back the investment and the trade with China to America's advantage. And at the same time, he has extremely weak hand, and every day that hand is getting weaker. In response, the Chinese bureaucracy has become extremely aggressive. As Trump weakens, so they become more frantically anti-democratic, and the obliteration of opposition in Hong Kong is quite surprisingly driven without any apologies to anybody. And I think the comrades who Ed has mentioned, were really prepared to fight on and on. I think each one of them should actually wonder how they're going to manage each day, because China has ways of making people disappear from anywhere around the world, and they reappear sometimes 5 years later in a Chinese prison. So we are dealing with an extremely dictatorial, in fact, a totalitarian regime. I'm reminded myself sometime of being briefly imprisoned in South Africa under apartheid. And when I was released, even quite conservative people would shake my hands and laugh about it, and then to be imprisoned in Zimbabwe, where there is support for the regime, and no one even wants to see you. They just want to walk on the other side of the road. And I think it's the other side of the road which people are experiencing in China, and that people who expressed dissident ideas, or even those who are prepared to engage in struggle, actually have a very tough time indeed. The Chinese regime, with its optics and its electronics, is one of the most efficient dictatorships I think the world has yet seen. And the attitude or the program and the policy in relation to the Uyghurs is unbelievable. It's been classified as genocidal or discussed as genocidal. There's a birth rate policy. There's the imprisonment of 1 million. There's all the tensions, as Ed's stressed, with trying to suppress people and separate them from religion. It could backfire enormously. But on the other hand, there's enormous state capacity to imprison not just hundreds of thousands, but even millions. I mean, on a scale which maybe the world has not yet seen. So we see in the balance of forces that China has become, the term has been used in terms of imperialism has been extremely, I would use the term extremely belligerent in relation to Hong Kong, and maybe even now in relation to Taiwan, which they've never let go. And the tensions are likely to be very high, in my view. I think a good point has been made there, you know, because of the determination of Taiwan, or at least the ruling party at the moment, you know, to be totally independent of China. Now, where's all this, you know, is going? When we look at the internal side, what I've seen now is the external mood to try and create nationalism in America and nationalism in China, you know, is the strategy of both ruling strata. Let me use that, you know, use that term. And then at the same time, the attempt is to try and use the military or the feds or anybody else to suppress dissidents. And I think that would be more effective in China than it has turned out to be in America. Now, while this balancing is going on, we've got the crisis, the economic crisis has also struck China. I don't know, I've seen a figure of 290 million migrant workers in China. And apparently these workers are not included in the unemployment figures. And when there is a crisis, an economic downturn, they are returned to their villages and not allowed to return to the cities, or only at their own risk. There's there are no specific benefits for them. It's somewhat similar to the situation in apartheid in South Africa, when there was a rigorous division between the black working class, between migrants and settled people. And apparently this is the way in which, you know, the ruling strata decide to rule. Now, where are we going with this? I think that everyone has agreed, various points have been made, but I think there's some agreement that we're not entering into a Cold War of the classical proportions with the USSR. China is extremely involved in world trade. At the same time, it's also dependent on US imperialism. When it comes to to its oil supplies and the rest, they are very keen, or not very interested in extending their military power, you know, towards Africa and towards the Middle East, because they know just how intractable the issues, you know, are there. But in a sense, they're dependent on American naval power to ensure that you know, those supplies, you know, move as they want. And so I think we're going to see a nasty exchange. We're going to see possibly, you know, more violent initiatives probably on the side of China, but also as Trump weakens, he'll be less and less likely, well, he may be tempted to lash out, you know, before the election. But I think that's less of a possibility. The possibility is, as Ed said, is for the working class in China to rise, as workers are rising in America in a very broad space. We're seeing, you know, and maybe certainly in America, and maybe in China, we're also seeing high levels of opposition. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that the state in China has extreme measures. It has capability of using extreme force or extreme measures of force. In other words, imprisonment, trials which are going to be rigged, no forms of escape for those who openly express dissent in China. So we look to see a political revolution in China, but I do think we need to look at the extreme difficulties, you know, of opposition rising at the moment, particularly when at this stage the state has become extremely ruthless against any form of opposition. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I don't have any hands up at the moment. Anybody want to make a contribution? Any takers? Nobody's got the hand up. Dave Buxton's got his hand up. Okay.
Thanks. I really want to ask a question about if anyone can say about the trade unions, what the system of trade unions is. I strongly suspect they're state-run unions, and it'd be interesting to know whether they ever have meetings at a workplace level. I suspect if they did, then if you can imagine what bureaucrats in unions are like here, that they'd be seen locally in a workplace as like puppets of the state, and that if you speak out in a meeting, then your name goes on the list and you may be down for some re-education. Does anyone know? And I also recall a few years ago there were suicides in the major electronics factories that supply the West with all its gadgets. And as a result of that, there were improvements made by the state in China to the working conditions. But not being naive about these things, is it possible that there was also some form of unofficial action that went along with these suicides? Because I can imagine if you were in a massive workplace, let's say of tens of thousands of people, and then you hear that one of your colleagues, or 2 or 5 or 10 over a short period of time, have committed suicide because the working conditions were so bad that the word would get around and maybe they took unofficial action. Can anyone say what the situation is with trade unions? And lastly, if you want to find out about what's actually happening in China in terms of the working class, what sources would you be able to use to have some idea what is actually happening on the ground? So they're my questions, really.
Thanks, Dave. Ed had his hand up. I think he wants to come back on that.
Well, I only want to come back if nobody else wants to say anything, because I've already spoken.
Sorry, there's nobody waiting at the moment. No.
Just in response to what Dave, or part of what Dave asked about unions, I read a very interesting book a couple of years ago called China on Strike, which was in English an account of the experience of workers in a number of different factories who'd taken part in organizing strikes against exploitation. And it makes it absolutely clear what, in relation to what you said about state-run unions, that not a single worker on the factory floor has got any confidence in state-run unions whatsoever. And when workers do organise, it's done in a very clandestine way, so that the people who are actually organising are difficult to identify by the management. And even then, they take huge risks. I mean, it's been quite common in a lot of strikes for the factory owners to back down, make concessions, offer a decent wage deal, and so on. And then after all the arousal of the workforce subsides, then those people who can be identified as leaders all mysteriously disappear. Maybe six or 10 people disappear and are not to be seen anymore in the factory. So, you know, it is extremely difficult to organise, and it's certainly, I have no evidence that any workers have confidence in the official unions, but other comrades may want to say something else.
Thanks, Ed. I've got iPhone Graham. I think that's Graham Durham, is it not?
Yeah, it is.
Good evening.
Yeah, good to see you, comrades. And just a big hello to Gregor. I don't think I've seen him for 40 years since we lived in Leeds together. two questions really. Gregor raised the issue about the Uyghur having a much more internationalist link to Muslim movements. I mean, is that the Chinese propaganda around this suggests that they are part of an international terrorist organization? Is there any evidence of that, and to what extent is that a threat to China? And the other question, while I'm talking, on Hong Kong, there have been attacks by Trotskyists in various parts of the world on the Hong Kong rebellion because it doesn't represent the working class of Hong Kong and doesn't include the working class of Hong Kong. And to what extent is that, in the view of the experts here, true? Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. There's no other hands back, but would somebody like to come back on that? Oh, wait a minute, there's two participants raised their hand. Let me just see who it is. Just a sec. Hang on, that's you. Ed, are you wanting to come back in? You seem to have your hand up again, is that correct?
Well, yeah, just in relation to this question about the character of the movement in Hong Kong, I mean, it's pretty difficult to make a claim that it's not a working class movement, because at one point there was a general strike organized in Hong Kong by the unions in support of the movement on the streets. So there's clearly an identity between the organized working class and the movement on the streets.
Thanks, Ed. Katie McCafferty's got her hand up now. Would you like to come in, Katie?
Yeah, just thanks very much. It's my first time at one of these meetings, but I know loads of the people at them. And it's a really interesting subject because, to be honest, I know as much about China as I do about polo rules. So for me, it's been a really interesting discussion. And I'm just wondering about what the effects of something like COVID is going to have on the Chinese economy outside of China. And why I ask that is if you look at the land banking that goes on in London, I think they say 1 in 7 properties is owned by Chinese companies, and lots of those that are not land banked are actually properties that are rented out to workers within the city of London and around the Canary Wharf area in particular. And as we've seen with COVID, there's been a lot more moving towards home working. So those properties won't be needed anymore. And I think there's going to be like a property crash, which will affect all the money that China has thrown into the city of London. So I'm wondering what sort of effect that will have in China on the economy there, as well as obviously the recession that's coming our way. But overall, I found it a really interesting discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Anybody want to come back on that, or shall we ask one of the... Oh, Jim Christie, you've got your hand up. I think you want to come back on that.
It's not particularly on that point. Sorry, it's just another slightly differing point. And it's just the nature of how the Cold War between the rival imperiums will bear out. I mean, too often I think we're still stuck in a bit of a time warp of thinking of hardware, capacity and armies. It seems to me that what you will be getting, as you already have, it seems to me, a low-level cyber warfare. And China has built up its capacity, and you see that in the current ways of imperialism on Huawei and even on things like TikTok, which is not exactly a major part of cyber warfare, but it's actually collecting data. And it's just going back to a point I was making earlier about Taiwan, is what China can easily say, in effect, is you can't send the 7th Fleet to the Taiwanese Strait. We'll take out the whole of the electricity supply of San Francisco and Los Angeles. And it seems to me that that is how that nature of the Cold War could well develop, with the increasing capacity of the rival imperialisms and the new type of warfare.
Thanks, Jim. Anybody want to come back on Katie McCafferty's points, one of the speakers possibly, or one of the meeting participants? Any offers? Okay, Ed.
Well, Katie, I just want to say I think that's a really brilliant observation. I mean, because this COVID crisis is certainly going to subvert a lot of property speculation in a lot of capital cities, and it will rebound on Chinese billionaires who've speculated on London property, and I'm sure it will contribute to to further economic crisis in China and making it more difficult for those who are trying to get rich in China through speculation to pursue their aims. So I'm really glad you made that observation. And incidentally, it's very nice to hear someone with a London accent asking a question like that, because working class Londoners are amongst the most hard hit in the world when it comes to the inequality between what you need for a place to live in and what you actually, the property that is actually available to you. And it's because of all this speculation that's going on. So thank you for your contribution.
Thanks, Ed. Excuse me.
That's why I had to move to Donegal, Ed. The property prices are a lot cheaper.
Thanks, Katie. Jimmy. You need to unmute yourself.
I've got to mute myself first. Okay, there's a couple of points I just wanted to put at, and it all comes down to one thing, that there is one hell of an enormous challenge required to transform China. I haven't had a great deal of experience, but I have visited, and it left impressions on me. And the impressions that it left is that the legacy of the Chinese Revolution is still maintained by the leadership. It's maintained as a badge of honor, and it's maintained as a legitimacy and an authority for them to be in power and to defend the historic revolution while they loot the country. The Communist Party appears to me to be made up of a number of threads. There's the remnants of the old men and women who were part of the revolutionary period. There's their children and grandchildren. And in this, it bears an awful lot of parallel to Ireland, in the sense that we underwent a revolutionary period, and the parties that came to power initially consolidated power and privilege, and then their children and grandchildren, and it's the tradition that carries through. But the difference between China and Russia, or China and Ireland is an impoverished country, even though it's reasonably civilized. But in China, there is massive, massive resources. And these resources, in terms of the party, is that the party can turn out conferences with thousands and tens of thousands, if necessary, of people, delegates elected to those conferences. But when you look at them, the old party, they're not political anymore. Like, I stayed with a family not too far from Wuhan, and that family were members of the Communist Party, but they weren't communists. They couldn't discuss communist ideas. They couldn't discuss. They had no understanding of their history. Never mind what was going on really outside their own parish. The idea of a conscious revolutionary party, or a conscious tradition, or a conscious awareness of the traditions, seemed to me to be very, very low. And it seemed to be very much like, in fact, it was very like what happened to the Republicans in the north of Ireland. That when the struggle stopped, it was only the memories of the past and the relationships of the past that kept them together. But their useful role to society ended. But what you do see is a massive army, a massive military structure, modern military structure, with economic resources to to support that. But right through, blended, woven completely into the structure of the bureaucracy, is the new rich, the same children of the and grandchildren of the revolution, who are ripping the country off on a massive scale. And you can see this in the towns and the villages, where you have the average house, the average district where workers live. And then you see the other areas, some of them are actually gated, some of them aren't. They're just gated by the fact that there's Mercedes and Audis and nice, huge, big Subarus parked outside them. There's divided areas in the towns and cities where the rich of those regions and those towns and cities live. Now, they are represented back into the party. Now, if there was to be an uprising in China, I have no hesitation in saying that it would be met with repression if necessary. It depends on the scale of an uprising. If it was a localized one, and again, some of the comments, I think it might have been mentioned the Foxconn situation where the suicides were. Initially, the response there was to ignore it. And then when it started to pick up traction on the world media, and the Americans actually, every time the Americans try to attack China, they actually shoot themselves in the foot because they make a lot of Chinese people aware of things as well. But the thing was that initially they tried to ignore it, and then they made concessions and they acknowledged that there were problems. And this seems to be the pattern. And then there's been other situations where there have been strikes, which were violent strikes or demonstrations, and they were met with, they were faced down by the military. And that reserve is there. Now, it appears also that the military command is woven again into this mesh of the bureaucracy. And they have vested interests. That it's not just a case that they're well paid and they're well looked after, but they also have vested interests because, like the Russian bureaucracy that went on to become the oligarchs, they're looting the wealth as well. And there's terrible prices to pay if that fails. So this puts up the final point I want to come to is that to challenge this in the terms of a political revolution, apart from spontaneous eruptions, but on a large scale, it's going to create an enormous, enormous responsibility. And at the moment, I'm not aware of any national underground structure. There are parties, there's groups of parties, there's factions, there's socialist discussions taking place, but there is no national fabric that appears to be in the making that can take on the enormity. And this is what makes me think that the transformation of China is not going to be an immediate one, that it's going to be a longer paced out, because again, an awful lot of this can change. Depend if there was a massive world collapse worse than 1929, it's going to leave a lot of people, a lot of hiding places going to disappear. But nevertheless, I think we've got to be very, very cautious about expressing. There is another organisation which a lot of us have had relationships with, and some of their comrades had the attitude that when China topples, it will be a spontaneous revolution of the workers and a spontaneous political as well as an economic revolution, and the workers will take power on a disintegrating structure. I don't see that happening. I see there being a bitter, bitter battle to be fought for the control of the state and for the control of the economy. And the role of the military is one that I really fear, internal military.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. There's no more hands up. It's now 20 minutes to 9. Unless anybody else wants to make any brief comments, I'm just going to ask the speakers if they want to just briefly say a few closing words. Is that all right with everyone? Yeah. Greg, would you like to say a few closing things? You need to unmute yourself.
Strength of
Oh.
the. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, we moved at the same time. Go on.
Okay, the strength of the Chinese working class. I mean, numerically, quantitatively, of course it's strong. Of course it's now a majority. Of course, a majority of Chinese now live in cities, whereas when the revolution took power in 1949, only 20% of the population lived in cities. But I would stress that up to now, since 1989, there's been no sign anywhere in Chinese political life of the emergence of a viable, coherent, self-confident opposition capable of taking on the regime. About Hong Kong, how should we look on the movement in Hong Kong? Is it working class? No, it's not working class. On the whole, it's educated people, students, and so on. There are signs of the beginning or the revival of trade unionism on a very small scale on the fringes of the Hong Kong movement. But I can see no evidence in Hong Kong of a revival of working class militancy of the sort that we last saw in Hong Kong in 1925-26. Is there any evidence of terrorism? This is what Graham asked in Xinjiang. I mean, there have been bombs and there have been deaths, but on the whole, the population has not been involved in these. It's a small fringe, and this is being used as an excuse by the Beijing regime to crack down on legitimate concerns expressed in the Uyghur population about the situation of Uyghur culture and religion. Lastly, on this question of nationalism, why is there nationalism in China? I forget, one of the comrades pointed out that there is still unfinished business on the national front. When the Chinese communists came to power in 1949, they poured scorn on the Kuomintang for its failure to put an end to the occupation of Hong Kong and Macau, and later on for the Kuomintang's championing of Taiwan as an outpost of anti-mainland political culture. And this issue, Taiwan, is now the outstanding one. A couple more have been added to it since: the East China Sea and the South China Sea. These are the issues behind Chinese nationalism. The real issue behind Chinese nationalism is that since the Cultural Revolution, the Beijing and its regime has lacked any other systematic vision with which to inspire the Chinese people, socialism, of course, and democracy, on which counts it fails. So this is why it clings to nationalism. In my own view about China is that partly because of the Cultural Revolution and the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, China lacks moral. Chinese people lost their moral integrity for a generation and became interested only in money, in getting rich, in having personal relations, which the regime allowed for the first time. People would hold hands in public and kiss and so on. I think that this is what's happening. The same thing happened in Eastern Europe. The destruction of working class morality by the regimes that dominated Eastern Europe and now China. So they're the points that I would want to make on the issues that have been raised by the very interesting discussion that you've allowed me to listen to. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. John, do you want a couple of minutes just to wind up? John Sexton, can I just ask, John, can you sit as near the microphone as you can? Because we have had terrible difficulty hearing you. If you're near it, might be easier.
I'm not sure what a microphone is.
Oh, that doesn't help. Somebody suggested you might be better off with a headset, actually, but...
Yeah, well, it's a bit late for that now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, if you just about 3 or 4 minutes, because we're getting close to the end.
Yeah, you know, I just, coming back on the trade union issue, I don't believe there's any activity by the official trade unions. The only activity I ever heard of, and this was through the second hand and third hand and through the press and so forth, was a group of workers actually who were on strike being attacked physically by representatives of the trade unions. So I'm not really sure if that's true. But the only working class, my direct knowledge of working class activity is that there were small groups of basically middle class activists, students, and people like that who actually went into factories and some just to investigate the conditions and then carry out publicity and so forth. There were some charities as well, some based in Hong Kong, the working class people who tried to, in other words, they were substituting for the fact there were no trade unions, and they acted as advisors to workers in who were taking action. And but I think they've been closed down now. There was a group in Beijing that I knew years ago that sent people they sent students into factories in Hangzhou and in Shanghai and around there, and there was a bit of a scandal. They managed to make some publicity, and they even got to talk to the factory management about complaining about working conditions and so on. But at one point, some of them were beaten up by Chinese subcontractors who were supplying contract labour to the factories, and they had a press conference, and I do remember some Western journalists came along, and but they didn't think it was newsworthy. They after a couple of minutes, they started rolling their eyes and walked out. That's about the extent of my personal knowledge of working class, of actually people trying to organise working class activity. There was
Thanks.
Sorry.
Sorry, I thought you finished.
I was just going to say there was a group of young people started doing the same thing again. This was I think last year. Group of, I think they're sort of like neo-Maoists or something, you know. But they were trying to support workers taking action, but they all got arrested. I think they've been released now, but under probably pretty strict conditions.
Thanks, John. It's really useful to have somebody on the ground like that can actually give an account. So that was really interesting. I'm just going to bring Ed in now to just say a final few words just to end the meeting off.
Okay. Thanks very much to all the comrades who've participated in this meeting. I think it's been really interesting and lots of different angles and experience. I'd just like to say, first of all, the very fact that world capitalism has staggered on since the financial crash of 2008 is largely due to the fact that China, which is an economy largely supported by state-owned production processes, China has been participating in world trade, and that's created markets and it's created economic growth that has actually supported the continued life of capitalism for another decade or so since the financial crash. Capitalism has way outlived its usefulness, and so also have the bureaucracy in China outlived the progressive role that they may have once played as the midwives of a revolution which brought in a distorted form, but brought socialized relationships of production into the biggest country in the world. It's undeniable that despite all the horrors and murders and inefficiencies of Mao Zedong's China, it's undeniable that China was raised from a position of medieval backwardness to a position where it came on a par, and now we see is able to begin to rival the big advanced capitalist countries of the world. In Hong Kong, we have seen a reflection of the social divisions in that society. Property prices so high that young people can't afford accommodation, and people don't just go on terrifying demonstrations where they could get tear gassed, arrested, beaten over the head with a bayonet and so on, with a truncheon. They don't go on demonstrations like that just for some abstract principle of democracy. They go on demonstrations like that because they are desperate and because they are frightened that if what little democracy, what little trade union rights exist in Hong Kong are crushed by the bureaucracy in Beijing, then it will be more difficult for them to fight for their rights. And there have been news reports that the general strikes that took place as part of those Hong Kong protests, this was more than a year ago, or about a year ago now, they were part, they demonstrate that trade unions were involved in this campaign. There are links between that campaign and the working class movement. The last point I'd like to make, and again, I defer to Greg's great knowledge of China here, and he's always more cautious than me in assessing what might or might not be possible in terms of political revolution. So I'm replying to Jimmy's point about how difficult it is to see a unified national movement of opposition arising against the bureaucracy in China. Of course, things like that have to incubate in the underground. They can't come into the public gaze and last forever as an opposition movement, because they'd be crushed. They can only come into the public gaze when they are ready to strike a blow against the repressive authorities. Again, I'll deal with facts, not speculation. And I go back to Poland. In the summer of 1980 in Poland, a trade union, a free trade union, independent of the bureaucracy, with 10 million members, grew in the space of 6 weeks. And that led to the Solidarność movement, which dealt such a huge blow to the Polish bureaucracy. These things don't happen until they're ready to happen. And when it does happen in China, of course, we won't be talking about 10 million workers. We'll be talking, you can multiply that by 10 or more, by 10 or 20. We're talking about a massive movement. It will emerge when it's ready to come into the public gaze. And once it comes into the public gaze, it's a fight to the death. either it wins or the bureaucracy wins. I'm not putting any time scale on it. We may have to wait a long time. We don't know what's around the corner. But we can be confident that it's only the working class that has the capacity to create a new future for humanity, to rid society of corruption, bureaucracy, of mismanagement, to free society of all the stifling effects of inefficiency that come with bureaucratic rule, and at the same time to demonstrate clearly that there is a socialist alternative to the capitalist system.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think we've had a fan. Oh, Carol, did you want to say something?
No, I'm just clapping.
Oh, just clapping, right. I was going to say, you're too late. I think we've had an absolutely fantastic discussion tonight. I'd like to give a big thanks to our three speakers, John Sexton, Greg Benton and Ed Bober. And thank you very much indeed for giving up your time to talk to us and share your experiences tonight. And also a big thank you to everybody who made a contribution to the discussion. I think it's been really worthwhile.
Sono i confini, rosse bandiere, o proletari